Chapter 13. Silent Night. Next morning, the static electricity had dispersed. The rose bed was normal. At this time of the year it was dark when the children came home, and so the only chance Roland had of inspecting the garden was after breakfast. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday passed, and nothing happened. He tried to vary his approach, so that no one would see what he was doing. He brought in coal, or carried cinders out, or threw scraps for the birds. He noticed that food landing near the bed was always the last to be taken, and the sparrows and starlings never gathered there to fight over a crust as they did in the rest of the garden. A single bird would dart in and snatch the food, and the quarrelling would not begin until the bird was clear of the rose bed. On Thursday morning, Roland was having his breakfast when Mrs. Watson threw a piece of burnt toast out of the window. The toast fell on the path and lay untouched. Roland saw one bird fly down from a chimney, but when it was over the garden, it braked in the air, shot sideways, and flew back to the chimney, where it sat, ruffling its feathers and wagging its head. A few minutes later it tried again, with the same result. No other birds came near. As soon as he could, Roland went into the garden. There were plenty of birds in the orchard over the fence next door, but they were all silent. Roland crossed the path, and as he came near to the rose bed, his hair started to move on his neck, and the palms of his hands tingled. By smuggling his mackintosh into the last lesson, Roland was able to leave school as soon as the bell rang. He cut through the playing field and ran a mile to the station, and so caught the early train, which went half an hour before his usual one. Roland sprawled in the carriage. His shirt was out of his trousers, rumpled in sticky folds on his back. He felt as if he was bursting in the carriage heat, but he would reach home before dark. The street lamps were on when he walked up the road from the station. He plucked leaves off the hedges as he passed. Ivanhoe, Fernbank, Strathdean, Rowena, Trelawney, respectable houses bounded by privet, each with its square of grass. 2 days ago the first Christmas tree had appeared in a front-room window, and now every house had one displayed, and they were all bigger than the first tree. Winfield, Eastholme, Glenroy, Orchard, Main. What could happen here, thought Roland. Even the toadstools are made of concrete. But it's our house that has the porch. He stopped in front of the porch, smelling the bitter privet leaves rolled between his fingers. The name of the house, carved on a varnished section of log, hung from 2 chains by the arch. Screwed into the door was a plaque which said, "Here live Gwen and Frank Watson." Then came a knot of flowers, and underneath, "With Nicholas, David, Helen, and Roland." But the porch still did not belong. It makes it worse, thought Roland. They'll know they've found us. He went into the garden. There was nothing to be felt. Roland put his school books away before going back to the rose bed. He touched the bushes, prodded the soil, walked round the bed. What makes it come? Is it the treasures? If it is, why isn't it there all the time? There was hardly any light except for the afterglow of the sun in the clear sky. The ground was freezing already. And then, in the middle of Roland's casting about, he felt the static electricity as suddenly as if a switch had been pressed. And when he looked at the rose bed, he saw the shadows of 2 men standing there. They were motionless, as they had appeared in the attic wall. Flat shadows. But they were not thrown on anything solid. They were shadows on the air. Roland backed away to the path, and the shadows stayed where they were. He edged round to the side. They narrowed with perspective until he was at right angles to them, and then they disappeared until he moved past them. They were visible from in front and behind, and Roland couldn't see through them. And yet, they were two-dimensional. They had no depth. Looked at from the side, there was not a hairline of darkness. Roland went closer to the rose bed. He was both frightened and excited by the shadows. "Just stay there," he said. "Just stay there. They'll have to listen after this. Just stay there till the others come." His throat ached, and the ache moved into the neck muscles, sending a sharp pain through his forehead. The air pricked with light. The shadows gleamed like ink. Roland's neck was cramped fast. He remembered how it had been in the attic, how he had watched until it was nearly too late. He was doing something by looking at the shadows, and the whining noise was coming now. He forgot about proving himself right. It was too dangerous. He had to move while he could. Roland floundered across the garden towards the house. His knees and the small of his back felt as though they were bubbles of air, and the ground was never where he thought it was. "Your tea's ready," Mrs. Watson called when she heard Roland in the kitchen. "Thanks, Mum," he said. It was 8 o'clock before all the family was ready to watch the television. Mr. Watson had settled down about 10 minutes earlier, and so when Mrs. Watson and the children joined him, they were surprised to find that he'd not switched the television on. "Is something wrong, Frank?" said Mrs. Watson. No, I'm listening to the carol singers. They're the first this year." In the distance, they could hear uncertain treble voices. "Silent Night," said Mr. Watson. "My favourite." "I heard them 3 weeks ago," said Mrs. Watson. "They start earlier every year." "I suppose before long," said Mr. Watson, "they'll run it in with Guy Fawkes and get all the collecting done at one go." "Are we having the telly on, Dad?" said Nicholas. "In a minute," said Mr. Watson, "in a minute. Let's be seasonable. It's not every night of the year we can hear carols, and we'll have to pay for them, so let's have our money's worth. They sound as though they're outside Mrs. Spilsbury's. We should get them at the next move." But as he said this, they heard the scuffle of feet in the porch. "Oh, really?" said Mr. Watson. "Already? It's a bit much to expect to be paid for something we can't hear. Go away. We want Silent Night outside the window before you have a penny." He winked at the others. "I'll complain to your union." There was a further scuffle, and the doorknob rattled. "Young scamps," said Mr. Watson. "They might have the decency to knock. Go away, off with you." A pause. Then they heard footsteps on the pavement, and a whispered muttering, and then, still whispered, "Ready? 1, 2, 3. And several voices in different keys began to sing Away in a Manger. Before they'd reached the end of the first line, there was a polite knock at the door. "That's more like it," said Mr. Watson, and opened the door. "Merry Christmas," said the small boy in the porch. He brandished a money box. "And a Happy New Year." "Now, why couldn't you do it properly the first time?" said Mr. Watson. "There was no need to rattle the door like that. And I did ask for Silent Night." The boy gaped at him. "What do you mean, mister? We've been up the road. No one rattled your door." "Come now, come," said Mr. Watson. "I distinctly heard you larking about in my porch." "We never—" "Thank you," said Mr. Watson. "We didn't—" "I said thank you. Now listen. All I'm asking is that you sing what I requested, Silent Night, and that you refrain from rattling my door. That's reasonable, isn't it?" "No one rattled your door, mister," said the boy. "We weren't anywhere near your door." Chapter 14. The High Places. Roland said nothing about the shadows. When the other children had come home, he'd not had the courage to go outside again. He realized, too, that nothing less than the shadows themselves would convince Nicholas. And next morning and all Saturday, there was no static charge in the garden. "I wish you'd have a look at that front door, Frank," said Mrs. Watson at tea on Saturday. "It judders every time a car goes past. It's the kind of noise that sets my teeth on edge. I could hardly sew for it this afternoon. It's become much worse lately." "Very good, dear," said Mr. Watson. "I'll see what can be done in the morning. You may need a touch of the screwdriver." "And I wish you'd paid those boys the other night instead of preaching at them. They've been in and out of that porch all day. It's their way of getting their own back, I suppose." "I explained at the time that it was a matter of principle," said Mr. Watson. "But what have they done now?" "Oh, they've been dragging their feet, turning the doorknob, flapping the letterbox, that sort of thing." "Didn't you stop them?" said Mr. Watson. "They're much too quick. They're off and out of sight the moment they hear the curtain rings move. I gave it up after the second time. They'll soon tire of it when they see we're not to be drawn." "Or they'll be provoked to worse mischief," said Mr. Watson. "My mother was once nearly frightened to death when some louts dropped a rip-rap through her letterbox. It could have set the house on fire, too. Oh, no. We must put a firm stop to it." "Listen," said Nicholas. "They're at it again. Shall David and I nip out and clobber them?" "Certainly not," said Mr. Watson. "I mean to deal with this once and for all. I'm going to catch them from behind. You just go on talking normally." "Don't do anything silly, Frank," said Mrs. Watson. Mr. Watson let himself out by the back door. The children and their mother listened to the shuffling that was going on in the porch. "Sounds as though there's quite a few of them," said David. "I wonder if Dad will be all right." "Don't be daft," said Nicholas. "That kid who was collecting was only 8 or 9. I still think we should clobber them. Dad'll lay the law down, but he won't do anything else except ask their names and addresses. And who'd be mug enough to give him real ones?" The back door opened, and Mr. Watson stamped in. "Too late," he said. "Not a soul in sight." "We heard them all the time you were out, Frank," said Mrs. Watson. "They've never stopped. Are you sure you went?" "My dear Gwen," said Mr. Watson, "the street lamp across the road shines right into the porch. They're hiding in gateways, but I'm not playing their game for them." "They're not hiding, Frank. You didn't listen to what I said. They were in the porch all the time, and they are there now." "Eh? What?" "Good heavens!" The letterbox snapped shut. "But this is preposterous!" Mr. Watson was pale with indignation. "We'll soon deal with that, though. If I open the door when they're not expecting it, I'll trap them against the porch. Then we'll see who's being so funny." "No, Dad," said Roland. "Don't. Please don't." Mr. Watson frowned Roland to silence and put his hand on the catch, taking care not to move the brass rings on the curtain. The doorknob turned. Mr. Watson threw the door open. Side 5. "Got you!" "Dad, no!" Roland tried to reach his father to pull him away, but he became entangled in the curtain. Mr. Watson was thrusting the door hard against the inside wall of the porch. "Now then," he said. "Now then." But as he eased the pressure, the heavy oak door scooped him off his feet and slammed him back into the room. The door crashed shut, and Mr. Watson fell over Roland, tearing the curtain down on top of them both. Nicholas pushed forward. "No, don't go," said Mrs. Watson. There had been something brutal in the speed with which the door had moved. "Nick!" They dragged the curtain from Mr. Watson. He was sitting dazed on the floor, and one eye was beginning to close. His nose was bleeding. "Hooligans," he said. "Armed hooligans." "You go looking for trouble," said Mrs. Watson when she bathed his eye. "For all you know, it could have been one of those teenage gangs off the overspill." "You said it was the carol singers." "I know I did, but it wasn't, was it? 8-year-olds wouldn't have done this, would they? Roland, come away from that window. You'll egg them on to something else if they're still hanging around. Ignore them and they'll soon lose interest." Roland watched the poplar branches curling like tentacles round the street lamp. The road glistened. But he knew that when he had stood next to his father at the door, all beyond the porch had been in darkness, except for the glow of a log fire burning nearby. It was 3 in the morning when Roland went downstairs. Coals tinkled in the grate, and the clock raced with the double note that Roland never heard in daylight. The front door vibrated, although the only traffic was the long-distance lorries on the main road a quarter of a mile away. He knew that it was up to him to do something. After this, there would be more than curiosity. He listened at the curtain. He'd switched off the pencil torch and clipped it in his pyjama pocket. There was no sound of movement or breathing in the porch, and so Roland eased himself into the space between the curtain and the door. Still no sound, apart from the quiet jarring of the wood. The air smelt of curtain, and a thin draught slipped round him. The coconut matting needled his feet. Roland braced himself onto his toes and looked with one eye through a gap between the letterbox frame and its hinge. Now that the room was dark, Roland could see quite well in the shadow light of Elidor. It was nowhere that he recognized. In his narrow angle of vision, there was nothing but mountains, peaks, crags, ice, and black rock stabbed upwards. The porch seemed to be at the top of a cliff or a knife-backed ridge. Roland had the sensation of a sheer drop behind him in the room. Down the mountainside in front lay a camp of tents, and there was a hunting party winding from it up a track that passed the door. The men rode stags and carried lances, and some had bows across their backs. Wolfhounds ran before them. Close to the porch there was a bivouac in the shelter of a rock. Here the fire Roland had glimpsed burned pale and colourless, and next to it squatted a man holding a spear. A hound sniffed at the porch, but was called off sharply. The riders looked at the door as they went by. One of them spoke to the man at the fire, who was now standing. He shook his head and pointed with the spear down to the camp. At this moment the door stopped vibrating, and the scene vanished, and Roland was squinting out at his own night, and all he could hear was the lorries. He lowered his heels. The man had been a sentry guarding the porch. They had found it. They knew it was a way through. They would come when they were ready. "It's my fault," thought Roland. "I made it. What can I do?" The door buzzed again. He lifted himself up. Although only a few seconds had passed, it must have been longer in Elidor. The fire was bigger, and there was a different sentry. The new man was walking up and down to keep warm. It must be freezing, thought Roland, and why do they need such a huge camp? They can't live up here all the time. There's nothing but rock and ice, thousands of feet high. High. A high place. High places. Who walks in the high places? Findhorn. That's it. The song of Findhorn. Malebron was going to look. He said there were mountains. Then they're looking too. It was impossible that this could be Malebron's camp. These men had his nobility, his bearing, his dress, but only Malebron had had the golden light about him. Their beauty was the beauty of steel, every line of them cut hard as an engraving. "Oh, what can I do?" thought Roland. The sentry halted and stared at the letterbox, as if he'd heard Roland speak. Then he came towards the door. Roland slid down as far as he could. He heard the familiar footsteps in the porch, and a hand pushed the letterbox open. The knob was turned. The door moved against the lock, scuffle, and silence. When Roland dared to look, the sentry was bending over the fire and stirring food in a pot. "It's my fault. I made it. I made it." The answer stopped him. I must unmake it. Roland fixed his eye on the porch. Go away. Disappear. Scram. Go on. The porch didn't hear. Roland tried to will it away, to think of nothing, but he could not imagine nothing. It had no shape to build in his mind. He felt as weak as if he was pushing the bricks with his hands. The sentry was restless and kept walking over to the door. Think, Roland told himself, think. How does a house fall? You don't just shove it over. The church, what happened first? It was the mortar between the bricks, running out. That's it. Bricks can't stay up without mortar. He closed his eyes and pictured the arch in his mind. When it was fixed there, he concentrated on the joints of the brickwork. Grey mortar, loose, dry, crumbling. Oh, come on! Come on! Roland heard a sound, a whisper like rain on leaves. He heard it again. A thin dust was settling in the porch. Come on, you porch! You're not all real. You're an echo, not all solid. Come on, you echo! Mortar grew to a trickle. He dared to open his eyes, and although the dustfall slackened, it did not stop. He forced his mind like a drill between the bricks of the porch in Elidor. The sentry yelled, but Roland broke his concentration only long enough to see that the man had noticed what was happening and was running to the camp. Come on, break! Come on, more! A brick fell, and another, and a crack went up to the roof. That's it! He picked at the gap, heaving, tearing. It was easier. The bricks dropped. If he could undermine the roof, the weight of the stone tiles would pull the whole thing down. But he was labouring now with the cutting edge of his mind dulled, and every stroke was taking more energy to drive home. Men were hurrying from the camp. He sobbed and groaned and hit unaimed blows at the porch with all his will. The men carried two-handed axes, and the first to reach the door swung his axe down into the wood. The house boomed like a drum. The axe was wrenched out and up, and down it smashed again. Roland gathered his energy and made one blind lunge. Everything of him poured out, and after that, there was nothing. And into this nothing, the porch began to fall. A third time the axe struck, but the blade was muffled, and the fourth made no sound at all. The men shouted in silence, and the porch grew dim. Beyond the peaks of the mountains, two beams of yellow light flashed in the sky. Behind the sky was a bloom of darkness. The shadow of another porch covered the bricks, close as a skin, but whole where the arch was broken. The man with the axe hewed the door, yet couldn't touch it, and he jumped clear as the roof and walls crashed towards him, and Elidor drowned in the headlights of a car that was turning off the main road. The twin yellow beams flickered through the poplar trees and glanced from the wall of the porch. Roland sagged against the door. The wood was like ice on his brow. Chapter 15. Planchette. The telephone rang while Mr. Watson was having breakfast. "That was the Brodies," he said when he came back to the table. They're giving a party for their two on the 29th, and ours are invited. There'll be a card in the post, but John Brady wanted to know now so that the date can be fixed. It'll be your night out, he said to the children, to make up for when your mother and I go to the Greenwoods New Year dance. I'm still not sure about that, said Mrs. Watson. They're young to be left. They're plenty old enough to look after themselves, said Mr. Watson, aren't you? But do we have to go to this party? Said Nicholas. Of course, said Mrs. Watson. It'll be great fun, and the Brodys are such nice people. We ought to see more of them. But we don't know the kids, said Nicholas. It sounds deadly. I can't stand past the parcel. We've accepted now, said Mr. Watson, and it lasts till 11:30, so I think you'll find it's quite a grown-up party. Oh, heck, said Nicholas. I must remember to put them on the Christmas card list, said Mrs. Watson. David came in from outside. Dad, have you seen the front door? It isn't half a mess. There were 3 gashes in the door. 2 of them were cut an inch into the oak, but the third was more of a dent, as if it had been made with less force than the others. I thought I heard banging in the night, said Mrs. Watson, but I must have turned over again. But this is vandalism, said Mr. Watson. We're being persecuted. It's intolerable. Really, the lengths they'll go to just to vent their spite. Why, this must have been done with an axe. That's what you must expect when you have overspill in a decent area, said Mrs. Watson. They shouldn't be allowed to build out in the country. People aren't going to change when they move from the city, and goodness knows what it will do to property values. It's sheer vandalism, said Mr. Watson. But later in the day he filled the gashes with a wood compound and tightened the hinges and the door catch, which seemed to cure the vibrations. I thought a touch of the screwdriver would do the trick, he said. The party loomed. The Brodys lived in a big house that had stood by itself among fields, but was now surrounded by the local council's new estate. Both the children went to boarding school. It's going to be wet, said Nicholas as they set out on the night. Oh, I don't think so, said Mr. Watson. Hard frost, clear sky. It'll stay like this for a couple of days at least. The glass is very steady. I meant the party, said Nicholas. Jennifer and Robert Brody met the Watsons formally on the doorstep. There were about a dozen other guests, and they drank fruit cup. They played games to break the ice. These involved pushing a matchbox from nose to nose and mixing the girls' shoes up and then having to find the owners. Then they danced to gramophone records. But Helen was the only one of the 4 who could dance. Nicholas had had 2 lessons, which made him more wretched than anybody. There were excuse-me dances and novelty dances and forfeit dances. Those without a partner had to dance with a mop. At 9 o'clock they went in to supper. There was a game with name cards to decide who sat where, but Nicholas cheated, so that the Watsons were together and at the far end of the table. "Isn't it smashing?" said Helen. 2.5 hours more, said David. "Can't we go now?" said Roland. But the food was good. The Brody children called their father Jojo, and he told funny stories all the time. Then everybody started to pull crackers. Roland pulled his with Helen. He unrolled the paper hat and read the motto and shook the cracker to see if it was empty. Something dropped on the table. "What's up, Roland?" said David. "Are you feeling sick?" "What have you got?" said Roland. "A hat, a motto, same as you." "What else?" "Only one of those useless bits of junk you always have in crackers." "What is it?" "A tie clip or something. A kind of sword made of pink plastic. It says Hong Kong on the back." "I've got a spear," said Roland. "Mine's a little plastic goblet," said Helen. "What have you got, Nick?" said Roland. "Please, Roland," said Helen. "Please don't go on." "What's inside your cracker?" said Roland. "Calm down," said Nicholas. "You'll have them thinking you've gone balmy. Tell me what's in that cracker, besides the hat and the motto." "Oh, that," said Nicholas. "A pink brick. Do you want it?" "A brick? You mean a stone?" "Oh, good grief, Roland, not again. Anyway, it's a dice, and it's a pretty poor one, too. The spots aren't coloured." "It's shaped like a stone. It could be made of stone, even if it is a dice," said Roland. "Well, it isn't. It's made of plastic, and so's everything else." "It's pushing things a bit," said David. "Or are you saying Malebron's sending us souvenirs from Hong Kong?" "I don't know what I'm saying." "That's true," said Nicholas. "But it's not a coincidence." "Of course it's a coincidence," said Nicholas. "Then if it is," said Roland, "it coincides with something. You don't have a coincidence on its own. And what it coincides with is the treasures. It makes them more real." David crossed and uncrossed his eyes. "You can't laugh them off now," said Roland. "Everything's linked. Malebron said so. Even if these are bits of a cracker, they're part of something else, and you can't get away from it." "Oh, do belt up," said Nicholas. "Are we all happy down this end of the table?" said Mr. Brodie, appearing behind David's shoulder. "Plenty of what you want? More pudding? Fruit cup?" Thanks, we're fine," said Nicholas. Roland went through the rest of the evening in a daze, which insulated him from the round of games and dances that followed. By about 11 o'clock, everyone was tired of dancing, and nobody could think of any fresh games. They all sat round the room, and it looked as though the last 30 minutes were going to drag into exhaustion. "I know," said Jennifer Brodie. "Let's have a séance, like we had last Christmas. Please, Jojo." "Oh, yes, let's," several others said. "Right you are," said Mr. Brodie. "But don't go scaring yourselves. It's only a parlour game, remember, there's nothing in it." "What's a séance?" said Helen. "Talking to ghosts, table rapping and that sort of thing," said Nicholas. "I don't want to do it," said Roland. "It sounds too creepy." "Come on," said David. "It's Christmas. And you heard him say it's only a game." "Please, may we use Granny's planchette?" Jennifer asked her mother. "It's more fun with that. And you had it out for your party last night." "If you take care of it, darling," said Mrs. Brodie. "Yes, Mummy." There was a conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Brodie at the door, but all Roland heard was, "Not as if they're old enough. Scribble, nothing frightening." "Our Granny was a spiritualist," said Robert Brodie, "and she had this planchette for getting messages from Grandpa. All he ever said was, 'Bury me under the river.'" "And did you?" said Nicholas. "You try it," said Robert. Mrs. Brodie came back into the room holding a small, heart-shaped board with a pencil sticking through a hole at the pointed end. The board stood on casters so that it could move in any direction. "The thing is," said Jennifer, "that we all sit round the table, and whoever works the planchette lays their right hand on it very gently, and the board travels across the paper on these wheels, the pencils touching the paper, and so you get what's called automatic writing. Only you mustn't watch what you're doing, because it's not you writing, it's the other side." "Sounds corny to me," said Nicholas. "No, it isn't," said Jennifer. "If you try to write deliberately, the board skids about. Now, who's going to do it?" "I think it's time young Roland here did his stuff," said Mr. Brodie. "He's been very quiet all evening." "I'd rather not," said Roland. "It's only fun," said Robert. Roland was hustled to the table, where the planchette was laid on the back of a roll of wallpaper. "The writing's big," said Jennifer, "so you need plenty of room. Put your fingertips on the planchette very lightly. That's it. Now, everyone sit still. You mustn't speak. Think of nothing. And if the board moves, Roland, don't look at it. It's best if you keep your eyes closed all the time. I'll do the talking bit. Right, off we go." They all sat round the table. Complete silence was impossible. Some of the girls started giggling almost at once. "Shh," said Jennifer every few seconds. My arm's going numb, said Roland. Can I have a rest? No, said Jennifer. Shh. 2 minutes went by, and Jennifer cleared her throat. Is anyone there? She said to the ceiling. Is anyone there? The planchette jerked, as if Roland had cramp in his arm, and the pencil made a formless scribble on the wallpaper. Is anyone there? Said Jennifer, and she nodded excitedly and stuck her thumb up. The planchette scribbled again. Who is it? The planchette moved along the paper in loops, like someone's first attempt at writing. Not bad, Roland, said Nicholas. I'm not doing anything. Shh, said Jennifer. Who is it? A squiggle appeared. My arm's gone cold, said Roland. I can't feel anything. If you talk, you'll spoil it, said Jennifer. Look. Another scribble. What's happening? Said Roland. The pencil wrote a barely decipherable Malebron. Helen squeaked. Ha ha, said Nicholas. What do you want? Said Jennifer. The pencil moved, and a figure of some kind appeared. What is that? Said Jennifer, speaking precisely. An amoeba, said David. I do not understand, said Jennifer. The pencil scribbled again. Another figure. And then a scrawled name. I still cannot understand, said Jennifer. Please tell me more. The pencil swept across the paper, and a unicorn appeared, standing on its hind legs. And then it wrote, Findhorn, cried Helen. What? Said Roland. What? The planchette immediately slid away. Did it write that? Findhorn? Malebron? This unicorn? Oh, you shouldn't have stopped, said Jennifer. It was coming so well. Enough's enough, said Mr. Brodie. He's trying to tell us about Findhorn, said Roland. The song of Findhorn, remember? Findhorn's a unicorn. He had to keep trying. All right, you did it nicely, said Nicholas. The other guests were staring. Your writing's crummy, but you always could draw. You'd be even better with practice. It wasn't me. Try it yourself. Okay, said Nicholas, I will. He put his fingers on the board, as Roland had done. Go on, write your name. Okay, cool off. But no matter how he tried, Nicholas could not manage the planchette. It rolled in all directions. One of the boys laughed. Here, give it to me again, said Roland. He may be wanting to tell us something else. Quick! I think that about wraps things up for tonight. Don't you, people? Said Mr. Brodie. Carriages at 11:30, you know. He became brisk, and Mrs. Brodie removed the planchette. Everyone started to pick up coats in the hall and to say thank you. Some were waiting for their parents, and others were being taken home by Mr. Brodie. He switched on the outside light and opened the door to go and bring his car round to the front of the house. A white mist coiled through the doorway into the hall. Oh dear, what a bore, said Mrs. Brodie. It won't be much fun driving in this. Those who aren't going with John had better take your coats off. Your parents may be some time. Put the gramophone on, Jen, and we'll have another dance. I think we'd be quicker walking, don't you? Said Nicholas. It's not far. Yes, said David. Really, we mustn't stay, thanks all the same. Can we ring up home to stop Dad from turning out, please? Said Nicholas. Certainly, said Mrs. Brodie, if you're sure that's what you want to do. Nicholas rushed to the telephone. Hello, Dad, he said. It's Nick. Look, don't bother to fetch us, we'll walk. No, honest. We'll be home by the time you can get here in this. We'll cut through the new estate and up Boundary Lane. You know that cinder path by the allotments. Yes, of course I know the way. Yes, we'll borrow a torch. Right. See you in about half an hour. They borrowed a torch, but found that there was no need to use it. The mist was a ground mist, and they could clearly see the tops of trees and houses and the bright moon. Anything rather than another dance, said Nicholas as they went down the drive from the house. Well done, Roland. You broke it up nicely. Old Jojo thought you were going to throw a fit. Roland didn't answer. How did you pick up the knack of that board so quickly? Said Nicholas. Shut up, said Roland. You what? I said shut up. Oh, all right. They walked in silence. The concrete road of the new estate was easy to follow, except where it branched or produced a roundabout. Near the Brodie's house, the estate was almost finished. The upstairs windows were dabbed with whitewash, and then, further in, the windows were raw holes, and the moon shone through the roofs. After that, there was nothing but the mist, and they followed the curbstone across what was still a field. It was a lovely unicorn you drew, said Helen at last. Just like the one on my jug. I didn't draw it, said Roland. Oh, lay off, said Nicholas. Malebron drew it, said Roland. He was trying to tell us something, and you stopped him. Now, listen, said Nicholas. It's about time you grew up. Shall I tell you what all that was about? You've got this Malebron thing on the brain. Okay, so you didn't fake it on purpose. You wrote it unconsciously, and you drew the unicorn because Helen found the jug when you were digging that hole in the garden. That's how people's minds work. If you'd read the books about it, you'd see for yourself you're up the creek. Oh, shut up, said Roland. The road ended near a stile that led into the cinder path by the allotments. The path had chestnut palings on one side and a hedge on the other. It ran through a no-man's land between two built-up areas and came out on the road where the Watsons lived. At one point, it crossed a stream over a bridge of railway sleepers. The path was so narrow that the children had to walk in twos. The night was absolutely still. Careful at the bridge, said David. There aren't any handrails. We're nearly... The sound of air being torn like a cloth burst on them, a dreadful sound that cracked with the force of lightning, as if the sky had split, and out of it came the noise of galloping hoofs. There was no warning, no approach. The hoofs were there in the mist, close to the children, just ahead of them, on top of them, furious. Look out! They fell sideways against paling and hedge as a white horse charged between them out of the moonlight, pulling the mist to shreds. All about them was hoof and mane and foam, and they heard the horse gallop away along the path and leap the stile into the field. The children clung to each other. Is everyone okay? Said Nicholas. Yes. I've ripped my coat. That was a near-do, said David. I didn't hear it till it clattered on the bridge, did you? It's probably bolted from the riding school, said Nicholas. It didn't have a saddle on, said David. It's broken out of its stable, said Helen. They wouldn't have left it outside in the winter. Yes, said Nicholas. Did you see the mess it was in? It must have fouled some barbed wire. But wasn't it a beauty, said David. That mane! The children crossed the bridge and walked on towards the road. I was scared, said Helen. But the poor thing must have been more frightened than I was. It couldn't have stopped, said Nicholas. If we hadn't got out of its way, it would have trampled us to bits. Don't say anything to Mum or Dad. They'd have a heart attack. Gosh, that put the wind up me, said David. Its tail hit me in the face, said Helen. Funny how the moonlight made it look so big, too, said Nicholas. That and being on a narrow path. I hope it's not in any pain, said Helen. It may do more damage if it's still frightened. It could have killed us, said David. Yes, but not a word, said Nicholas. They were on the road now. Tidy yourself a bit, Roland. We don't want to look as though we've been beaten up. But Roland hung back in the middle of the road. "Come along, Roland, keep together." "Why are you talking like this?" shouted Roland. "You all saw it. Why are you pretending? You saw the horn on its head."